Okay, at this point I'm relatively happy with how the search box works. I want to do a little bit of code cleanup, and then what I want to do for the search component is put this into a modal so that users can bring up this search, choose their 3D object, and then close the modal and get back to the camera screen. First, let's do some minor code cleanup. We're just going to pull some of the stuff out into separate render functions. So let's call one render load more button. And inside of here, we'll put our logic for loading more. Let's just cut this part and we'll return it like that. So if the results are 0, we'll return a view, otherwise we'll return the button. And inside of this, we can say this.render load more button. I also want to put this text input since it's got kind of a lot of properties. I'm going to cut that and put this in a function called render search box. I'll call it render search input. And we will return that. And then up here, we'll call this .render search input. That way we don't have as much clutter going on with that. Okay, our next step will be to add the search component to a modal that we can open and close when the user clicks a certain button. So we need to come up to the top where our imports are, and we need to import modal from React Native. Now the way modal works, if you're not familiar with it, you can check the modal documentation on the React Native website. It takes a property called visible, and when that's true, the modal is visible, and when it's false, it's not. So we will create a state variable called visible, or let's call it search modal visible, and by default it will start off as false. And why don't we collapse some of these functions so we can see a little better. And what we want to do here is wrap our search component into a modal with the visible property set to this.state.search modal visible. And let's indent this properly, and we'll put everything into a view. And if we reload, hopefully we shouldn't see anything because the modal is now not visible. But if we come up here to our state and set this to true, we should see our search query. So now we need a way to toggle this on and off. And to do that, we'll return back to our camera screen, and we'll add a new button called show modal. So let's add a button down here. Title equals search, and on press equals this.on. Well, we've already got an on search press, so let's say on search modal press. And to implement that function, on search modal press, all we need to do is say this.setState search modal visible equal to true. Now that'll open the modal. We'll still need a way to close the modal, which we'll add in just a second. So let's first combine these now. So we'll take our modal and we'll put that down here. It doesn't really matter where you put it because it's going to cover up everything when it's open and it won't be visible when it's closed. So we can just add it to the bottom and we don't need to worry about it covering up our buttons or anything like that. So I'll save that. And actually we need to get rid of this return. So now we're returning our Expo graphics view, our buttons, and our modal. Refresh. Now we've got our add turkey button and our search button. When we click that, it's going to pull open the modal, and we have no way currently of closing it, so we'll need to add a close button to our search component. Alright, so why don't we add a button right below search, and we'll just call this button cancel. And the on press will be this.onCancelPress. And we'll come up here, right below on search press, we'll say on cancel press, and we'll say this dot set state search modal visible equal to false. So now we have a way to close the modal when we don't need it anymore. So when I click search, I get the modal. When I click cancel, it disappears. Now, if we come back over to the modal docs, and they've got an example right here, it has an animation type equal to slide, and I think that will make the modal slide up and it might look a little bit nicer. So why don't we copy this and add this to our modal and see if that looks a little bit nicer. So I'll add it and refresh. When I click search, it now slides up and slides down, and I kind of like how that looks. All right, before we go any further, as I've been scrolling through this file, I noticed some stuff that I want to clean up. So let's delete this piece of code, which is just displaying the image of the turkey object. We don't need that anymore since we now have our Google Poly asset component. Up here, we were searching for duck, and we don't need to do that every time the component loads. So now we've got our constructor, and let's just scan through real quick and make sure everything's good. This is where we're initializing our rendering. This is where we're actually doing the rendering. We're going to clean this up later once we start displaying the search results onto the camera. We'll probably delete that function. So I'm going to keep that now. Okay, it looks a little bit cleaner. Okay, one last thing I want to do is I want to actually pull the search component into a separate component. It might have been a good idea for us to have done this earlier. It might have been a little easier, but we didn't do that, so let's go ahead and start extracting this out into a separate component. So we'll come over to our app components folder and we'll create a new file. And let's call this searchable Google Poly asset list.js. It's kind of a long name, but it describes what it's doing. I'm going to import React from React, and we'll try to remember the components we were using. We were using a view, a scroll view, a button, and let's start with that from React Native. And we also need to import Google Poly asset. Let's put no brackets this time. From Google Poly assets. In this case, we're importing it directly from the file rather than from our index. And then we'll export our default class, searchable Google Poly asset list, which extends a React.component. It'll have a render method, which for now will return a blank view. And let's get style sheet in here. So we can put our styles down here. Const styles equals style sheet.create. And whatever styles we want, we'll put into there. Save that. Let's close some of this stuff out. And we'll open up our components index and import searchable Google Poly asset list from searchable Google Poly asset list. And we'll also export it, and save that, and close it. Now on our home screen, we can also import the searchable Google Poly asset list. We can pull it from the app components folder since we added it to our index, and save that. Let's scroll down and we'll just copy this scroll view to start off with, and that'll be the basis for our component. So we're going to have a searchable Google Poly asset list, which we place inside the modal from our home screen. So here we will paste that, and let's adjust some of the indentation there. Okay, we're going to need all of these functions as well, so search input, current results, and the load more button. So let's go and grab those. Here's current results, search input, and the load more button. We'll copy those and paste those into here. And let's do a check. So this one is using a current results state property, so we're going to need to add that. So let's add a constructor which takes props, Remember to call super props, and it'll say this dot state equals, and it's got current results, which is a blank array. All right, that should be all we need for the load more button. We've already imported button and view, so we'll collapse that. If we take a look at our render current results, it's also using the current results array. It's using text, which we have not imported, so let's add text there. It's using current results, Google Poly asset, which we did import, view, so all of that looks okay. We may want to start pulling some of these styles out into our styles object later. That should be fine. And then text input, we did not import either, so let's also import text input from React Native. And it's using this.state.search query, so why don't we create our search query. It's also calling a function called onChangeText, so let's grab that out of our home screen. If we can find it, I think it's onSearchChangeText, so we'll copy that and we'll place that in here. Alright, we also need to pull in our ButtonPress Functions, so let's switch over to the home screen, and we've got the onLoadMorePress function and the onSearchPress function. So let's grab onLoadMorePress first, bring it over here, and we'll paste it right there. So as you can see, onLoadMore is using this.GooglePoly, so we'll need to pass in Google Poly. And oops, back on our home screen, we've got also onSearchPress, which we'll copy and paste into here. And this is also using this.GooglePoly. And let's delete those console.logs since we know that's working correctly. And these are setting current results. Okay, so all we need to do is pass in Google Poly. I still want Google Poly to be managed by the home screen, so let's pass it in as a property. So as a reminder to ourselves, we'll create a static default props object, and we'll say Google Poly is going to be equal to an empty object. And instead of this.GooglePoly everything, we're just going to say this.props.GooglePoly. So everywhere we're using Google Poly, we'll just say this.props.GooglePoly. Believe that's all for that. And right here, this.props.GooglePoly and this.props.GooglePoly. Okay, can save that. Now let's try to actually use this component in our home screen rather than what we've currently got. So we'll come down here and delete this whole scroll view thing, and instead of that we'll have a searchable Google Poly asset list with a property called Google Poly equal to this.GooglePoly. And let's just go ahead and delete these functions here that we were using before. So that's the load more button, the current results, and the search input. We can delete onLoadMorePress. We can delete onSearchPress. Okay, save that. Let's do another review. We can delete this. We'll still need our onCancelPress because this is going to set our Modal Visible to false. So we're actually going to want to pass this function into here because this one has the cancel button, I believe. Let's figure out where that is. Yeah, right here. So the cancel button, so we need to, instead of calling this.onCancelPress, we'll call this.props.onCancelPress, which allows us to pass in a cancelPress function. And again, as a reminder for ourselves, we'll add it to our default props, and we'll set it to a function that doesn't do anything. Oops, I spelled press incorrectly. So onCancelPress. And then back down here on our searchable Google Poly asset list, we're going to pass in the Google Poly and a onCancelPress function, which is equal to this.onCancelPress. All right, now let's test it out and hopefully it will work. When we click search, we get an error. it says nothing was returned from render. That's because the render function doesn't have a return statement. So let's put all of this into the return here and indent it and try it again. Okay, we'll click search, and there we have it. Oops. We've got our modal. When I click cancel, it closes it. If I type Turkey and search, it shows us some results. If I click load more, we get some more results. And actually now we have an odd number, so that was one thing we needed to test, was if we didn't have an even number of results, what does it look like? So there you have it. And we may actually have a bug. Looks like it's loading more the same results. So to fix the load more button bug, we need to change the logic that we're currently using to show the load more button. Right now what we're saying is if there are any results, then we're going to show the load more button, but what we should actually do is check if there is a next page of results. And so the way that we could check if there's a next page of results is to look at the next page token variable. So if we check this.props.googlepoly.nextPageToken, if that does not exist, then we will show a blank view, but if it does exist, we will show the load more button. So let's save that and test it out. Come up to our search and we'll search for Turkey. We notice that we do not have a load more button at the moment. I'll click search and we have some results. Down here we've got a load more button. When I click that, it will load more results. And it loaded 3 more, and it looks like that was the end of the results for that search. As you can see, there's no more load more button. So we should be able to now let the user select an object that they've searched for by clicking on it, and then we'll display that object in the camera.